The garage door still sticks if you don't lift the handle just right, and I'm the only one in this family who remembers that. My name is Claire, I'm 33, and the house on Birchwood Lane wasn't a gift, it was a receipt. My father spent 26 years installing HVAC systems in other people's houses before he and my mother could afford one of their own, and even then, they didn't buy it outright. They paid it down, year after year, my mother clipping coupons out of the Sunday paper until the day she didn't have to anymore. I remember the year my dad finally burned the mortgage paperwork in the backyard fire pit. How he laughed in a way I'd never heard before, like something had been sitting on his chest for 2.5 decades and had finally gotten up and walked away. When I turned 30, they put the deed in my name. Not a wedding gift, not a graduation gift, just a Tuesday. My mother made pot roast, and my father handed me a manila envelope across the dinner table like he was passing the salt, and inside was the deed with my name typed on it, Claire Dunmore, and nobody else's. He said, "Your mother and I talked about it. We don't need the house. We need to know it's safe." That was the whole speech. That was everything he had to say about 26 years of his life. I married Nathaniel 2 years before that dinner, and we moved into the Birchwood house 11 months after the deed transfer, once his contract job in Ohio finally wrapped, and he came back to Pennsylvania for good. For a while, it really did feel like the version of marriage you see in the commercials. We repainted the kitchen a color called Wheatfield that was really just beige with a better name. We hosted his coworkers for a Super Bowl party, and I burned the chili, and everyone pretended not to notice. I used to stand in the doorway some mornings just looking at the house, at the light coming through the kitchen window the way it always had since I was a kid, and feel like I had landed somewhere solid. The first sign of trouble didn't look like trouble. It looked like Nathaniel saying his mother's name more. Diane's lease is up in March. Then a few weeks later, Diane mentioned she hates her apartment complex. The walls are paper thin. Then, Diane was saying how nice it must be to have all this space. I want to be honest, I didn't flinch at any of these individually. People talk about their mothers. That's normal. It's the accumulation that gets you. The way each comment is small enough to let pass, but together they start drawing a shape, and you don't see the shape until it's already standing in your kitchen. It was a Thursday in October when Nathaniel finally said it directly. We were at the dinner table, the one that came from my grandparents' farmhouse in Lancaster County, scratched along one edge from 40 years of use before it ever got to me, and he set down his fork and said he'd been thinking, really thinking, about converting the den and the spare bedroom into a more permanent setup. For his mother. And for his sister Bridget, who'd recently split from her boyfriend and needed, in his words, a soft place to land. I asked him if he understood whose house this was. He said, "Claire, what's yours is mine, that's how marriage works." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, the ways you sit with a bruise to see how deep it goes, and I watched his face while I did it. He didn't backpedal, he didn't soften it. He'd clearly said some version of that sentence to himself enough times in his own head that saying it out loud to me didn't cost him anything. That's when I understood this wasn't a passing idea. This was a plan that already had a shape, and I was just the last person being told about it. 4 days later, Diane showed up with 2 rolling suitcases and a third bag slung over her shoulder, like she was moving in for a season, not a visit. She didn't ring the doorbell. She used the spare key Nathaniel had apparently given her without asking me, let herself into the front hall, and called out, "Knock knock, it's just me," in a voice that suggested she'd already decided the knocking was a formality. She walked through my house like an appraiser. She opened the hall closet and made a small noise about how much could fit in there if it were organized properly. She stood in the doorway of the den and said it got good light, said it twice, like she was trying the room on for size out loud. Nathaniel trailed a few steps behind her the whole time, hands in his pockets, not quite meeting my eyes, like a man walking someone else's dog and hoping it doesn't bite anyone. Diane found me in the kitchen, where I was standing at the sink because I needed somewhere to put my hands. She launched into a speech I'm fairly sure she'd rehearsed on the drive over. Something about how families take care of each other, how she didn't raise Nathaniel to watch his own mother struggle, how generosity was supposed to flow both directions in a marriage. Every sentence was built so that disagreeing with it would make me sound cold. I'd heard speeches like that before, just never standing in my own kitchen with my own dish towel in my hands. Then she held out her hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled, like she'd done this gesture 100 times before and it had always worked. She asked me for a copy of the house key. The refrigerator hummed. I could hear it because the kitchen had gone that quiet. I could hear Nathaniel shift his weight somewhere behind her, the floorboard giving its small creak. And what moved through me in that second wasn't anger, not yet. It was something stranger, something close to clarity. Like a fog lifting off a road you'd been driving blind through for months. I looked at her open hand. I looked at her face, which had the calm, expectant look of a woman who had never once been told no and didn't have a contingency plan for it. And I smiled. Not a polite smile. The kind of smile you give someone right before you change the terms of the conversation entirely. I set the dish towel down on the counter, folded once, the way my mother taught me. I said, "Diane, I think we should clear something up before this goes any further." My voice came out steady, which surprised me more than it seemed to surprise anyone else in the room. Nathaniel took a half step forward, the kind of move people make when they sense a room slipping out of their control. Diane's hand stayed exactly where it was, still open, still waiting, like she expected the universe to eventually catch up and put a key in it. I let the silence sit for one more beat. Then I told her that this house was not Nathaniel's to offer anyone. I told her it wasn't mine to share the way she seemed to think it was. I told her slowly that this house belonged to my father first, and my mother first, that 26 years of HVAC repair calls in other people's basements and attics were poured into these walls, that every Sunday coupon my mother had ever clipped was part of this foundation, and that when they put that deed in my name, they weren't handing me a building. They were handing me proof of every sacrifice they'd made, so I wouldn't have to make the same ones. And I was not going to give a single piece of that away to a woman who walked in with suitcases and a redecorating plan and called it family loyalty. Diane's hand dropped. Not gradually. It dropped the way a marionette drops when somebody lets go of the string all at once, with no in-between. Her face, which had carried that confident, practiced calm since she walked in the door, did something I hadn't seen it do yet. It went still. Then it went pale, the color leaving in a way that looked almost physical, like watching a light dim from the inside. Nathaniel said my name. Just that. The way people talk when they reach for something and there's nothing there. I turned to him because what came next was for him, not for her. I told him I loved him. I told him I'd meant every word at our wedding, every vow, every promise about partnership. But I told him love didn't mean handing over the one thing that wasn't mine to give. I said what's mine is yours. I believe that, I live by that, but what belongs to my parents is sacred. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped being able to tell the difference between those two categories, and I needed him to learn it again, right now, in this kitchen. I walked to the drawer by the stove, the second one down, where I kept the folder my father had put together when he transferred the deed. He'd organized it the way he organized his work van, every paper labeled, every page in order. I set it on the table. I opened it to the page with the names. I turned it so both of them could read it. I tapped the line once with my finger. My name. Only my name. Diane stared at that page for a long time. Nathaniel stared at it too, and something in his shoulders changed. A slow deflation, like watching the air go out of something that had been overfilled for weeks. I told Diane without cruelty that she was welcome in my home as a guest, the way any guest is welcome, with a bed made up and clean towels and a warm dinner. But I told her the conversation about keys, about permanent rooms, about restructuring a house my parents spent 26 years earning, that conversation was finished. It had ended the second she held out her hand expecting it to be filled. She didn't argue. She didn't cry either, though I half expected it. What she did was quieter than both of those things. A kind of recalculating, the look of someone realizing the room they walked into wasn't the room they'd planned for. Nathaniel drove her to her sister's place 40 minutes away. He came back almost 3 hours later, long after I'd already cleared the table and put the folder back in its drawer, and he sat across from me at that scratched-up farmhouse table and didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said, "I should have talked to you before any of this started." I told him he was right. He said he understood that now in a way he hadn't a week ago. I told him understanding it now was the only version available to either of us, so that's where we'd start. The next 3 weeks were the most honest conversations we'd had in our entire marriage. Things that had been sitting underneath the surface for a long time finally came up into the light. Things about money, about whose family's needs got treated as emergencies, and whose got treated as inconveniences, about how he'd let his mother's expectations sit in the passenger seat of our marriage without ever telling me she was there. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't supposed to be. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like we were actually building something between the two of us, instead of just occupying the same square footage. Nathaniel still calls his mother twice a week. When Diane and I talk now, it's careful. The way two people are careful when they're learning new rules to an old game. It isn't warm yet. But it's respectful, and I've come to think respect might be the more honest version of warmth anyway. It doesn't ask you to feel something you don't feel. It just asks you to acknowledge what's actually true. My parents don't know most of what happened that week. My mother would lie awake over it. My father would get quiet in that specific way he gets quiet when something he built is threatened, and I didn't want to hand him that weight at 68 years old. What I know is enough for both of us. The house still smells the way it always has, fresh paint over old wood, something warm underneath all of it. My father's 26 years are still in those walls. My mother's coupon-clipped Sundays are still in that foundation, and the key is exactly where it belongs, in my hand, where my parents put it.